The afternoon sun hung low over Maplewood Estates, the kind of neighborhood where the hedges were always trimmed and the silence felt expensive. Daniel had just stepped out of the corner store, a paper bag tucked under one arm, when something made him stop. Across the street, in front of the largest house on the block, a woman stood perfectly still at the iron gate. She was dressed like someone who had a driver waiting, tailored coat, heels that cost more than his monthly groceries, not a single hair out of place. Then the front door swung open. An elderly woman appeared, small, sharp-eyed, back straight as a judge. Without a word, she lifted a bucket and threw the water directly into the younger woman's face. The sound of it cut through the quiet street. Daniel froze. The woman in the tailored coat didn't scream, didn't step back, didn't raise her hands. She just stood there, soaking wet wine, eyes forward, like she'd already decided a long time ago that she wouldn't fight back. The old woman's voice came out low and final, the kind of voice that had made decisions for decades. You chose your world, stay in it. The gate slammed shut. And still the woman didn't move. It was only when a neighbor whispered nearby, "That's her granddaughter. She comes back every year," that Daniel understood. This wasn't a stranger at the wrong address. This was family. What could she have possibly done to be turned away like that by her own blood? Daniel Mercer had lived on Hartwell Lane for 6 years, and in that time he had learned to read the street the way you learn to read weather, by paying attention to the small things. He knew that Mrs. Patterson at number 12 left her porch light on all night because she was afraid of the dark, even though she was 73 and would never admit it. He knew that the Rodriguezes at number 8 argued every Sunday morning and made up every Sunday afternoon, and that their marriage was, by all appearances, thriving. He knew that old Mr. Collins 2 doors down kept a bottle of good whiskey behind his gardening gloves, and that it was never polite to mention it. And he knew Eleanor Ashford. Everyone on Hartwell Lane knew Eleanor Ashford, though most of them kept a respectful distance, the kind of distance you give to someone who has earned it through decades of clear, unblinking judgment. She was 78 years old, and she carried herself like a woman who had never once doubted a decision she had made. Her house, the largest on the block, set back behind iron gates and old oak trees, had stood for 50 years, and she had lived in it for all of them. The hedges were always trimmed. The windows were always clean. The garden was maintained with a discipline that bordered on severity. She had no husband. Her children had moved away. But she did not seem lonely exactly. She seemed chosen, as though she had surveyed the options and selected solitude the way other people selected furniture. Daniel had become, over the years, one of the few people she tolerated with something approaching warmth. It had started simply, a fallen branch blocking her gate after a storm, and Daniel clearing it without being asked. She had watched him from her window and said nothing. The next morning there was a jar of homemade preserves on his doorstep with no note. He understood that this was, for Eleanor Ashford, the equivalent of a standing ovation. After that, he would bring her groceries when the weather turned bad. She would leave things on his doorstep, preserves, once a small potted herb, once a child's book that had clearly been saved for decades, which she gave to his daughter Emma without explanation. He never pushed past what she offered. He never asked about her family. Which made it all the stranger then that he now knew what her granddaughter looked like, soaking wet, standing at the gate, not moving. Her name was Emily Ashford, and if you searched it online, which Daniel did that evening, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, you would find no shortage of results. CEO of Stratton and Voss Consulting, 38. Named to Forbes as 40 under 43 years running. Built a mid-sized consultancy into an industry leader within a decade. Known for her precision, her silence in meetings, and the unnerving accuracy of her predictions. There were interviews, though she gave few. In one, a journalist had asked her about her background, specifically whether growing up in a wealthy family had given her advantages that others didn't have. Her answer had been careful in the way that only truly guarded answers are. My family gave me a very clear picture of what I did not want to build. The journalist had laughed, assuming it was a joke. Emily Ashford had not laughed. Daniel put his phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He should have walked away. That would have been the reasonable thing, to pick up his bag and go home and let the street return to its expensive silence. He didn't. Yeah. He stood at the corner and watched the woman in the wet coat turn away from the gate, and he watched her walk, not toward a car, not toward the bus stop, but simply away, in the way that people walk when they are not going anywhere and cannot stop moving. Her heels were wrong for the cracked pavement on the far end of Hartwell Lane. Her arms were crossed over herself, though the evening wasn't cold enough to warrant it. He followed at a distance he told himself was respectful. At the end of the block, she stopped. She was standing at the edge of the small park, the one with the broken fountain and the bench that the city had been meaning to replace for 4 years. And she was very still, the way she had been still at the gate, like she had practiced not moving when things hurt. He slowed, cleared his throat. She turned, looked at him with the kind of direct, measuring look that made most people feel they had already said something wrong. "I'm not following you," he said. Then, hearing how that sounded, I live on the lane. I'm walking back. A pause. She looked down at the paper bag under his arm. "You've been standing at the corner for 3 minutes," she said. He did not have an answer for that. She turned back to the fountain. He stood there weighing the options and decided to sit on the broken bench, which had nothing to do with her and which she could therefore choose to ignore entirely. She didn't ignore it. She sat too, one arm's length away with the careful distance of someone who has decided this is tolerable. They sat in the semi-dark. The street lamps on this end were intermittent at best. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. "She does this every year," he said without thinking. She looked at him. "The neighbor told me," he added. "I didn't." He stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not." "Every year," she said, and the two words were flat and factual, like she was confirming a weather pattern she had stopped expecting to change. "Yes." "And you keep coming back?" "Yes." He didn't say anything else. He thought about asking her name, but it seemed wrong. Too much acknowledgement that he had been watching something he wasn't meant to see. He thought about offering her the coat he wasn't wearing. He thought about a lot of things and said none of them. After a while, she stood. "I'm at the Aldrin," she said. It was the small hotel 2 streets over. Not the kind of place a woman in a coat like that usually stayed, but close. Close enough to walk to Hartwell Lane in uncomfortable shoes. He stood too. "I'll walk you back." He said it before he'd finished deciding to. She looked at him for a moment, that assessing look again. "You don't have to." "I know." He picked up the paper bag. She looked at it, then at him, then ahead at the street. They walked. It was 5 minutes, maybe 6. They didn't speak. The night was mild and the street was nearly empty, and somewhere behind them, Eleanor Ashford's house sat dark and gated and 50 years certain of itself. Ahead, the Aldrin's faded sign hummed softly. At the door, she stopped. "I don't know your name," she said. "Daniel. Wall." She nodded once, as though filing it. "Emily." And then she went inside, and the door closed, and Daniel stood on the pavement for a moment with his paper bag and the mild, strange feeling of having done something small that was not, somehow, nothing. He walked home slowly. He didn't know yet that she would still be there in the morning. He didn't know about the contractors or the uncashed checks or the thing that had made a woman spend 20 years building something so solid that it could bear the weight of everything she had walked away from. He only knew that someone had been turned away at a gate and had not known where to go afterward, and that he had walked with her until she did. She had arrived 3 days before the incident at the gate, 3 days before the bucket, before the neighbors whispered, before the wet coat and the quiet walk to the cauldron. It was worth going back to the beginning of those 3 days because the beginning explained the rest. Daniel had been in the driveway with Emma, trying to explain why a bicycle tire needed air in a way that a 5-year-old would find interesting and failing at it, when the first vehicle had turned onto Hartwell Lane. A moving truck, followed by a white van with a contractor's logo on the side, followed by a sleek black car that idled at the curb with the quiet confidence of something very expensive. The gates of Eleanor Ashford's house opened. The trucks went in. Emma had watched with wide eyes. Is someone moving in with the old lady? I don't know, Bug, Daniel had said, watching the black car. The door opened. A woman stepped out. She was dressed for a boardroom, not a residential street, and yet she moved across the gravel path with the focused economy of someone who had learned never to waste motion. She didn't look at the neighbors. She didn't look at the street. She looked only at the house, and even from a distance, Daniel could see that the look on her face was not the comfortable look of someone coming home. It was the careful, braced look of someone preparing for impact. He found out quickly enough what was happening. The contractor's van was there for 3 days straight. By the second morning, the sounds of renovation had begun, measured, professional, unhurried. New kitchen fixtures he heard from Mrs. Patterson, who had sources. A new bathroom on the ground floor, which was practical for a woman of Eleanor's age. Fresh paint in the sitting room. A hospital-grade railing along the main staircase. Every modification was thoughtful. Every modification was, in its own way, completely wrong. He understood this the moment he heard Eleanor's voice carry across the garden on the second afternoon. Not loud, but with the kind of precision that doesn't need volume. I didn't ask for this. And Emily's response, patient and measured, which was somehow worse, I know, but you need it. What I need, Eleanor had said, is not your business. There was a silence that Daniel, standing at his own gate with a bag of groceries, did not know how to interpret. Then the sound of a door being closed firmly from the inside. He walked home slowly. He thought about the preserves on his doorstep. He thought about the iron way Eleanor held her back when she stood in her garden. He thought about a woman who had spent decades building an identity out of not needing anything, and what it would feel like to come home and find your house rearranged by someone who had left. He wasn't trying to listen. That was the honest truth. He had come over on the third evening to drop off the medication Eleanor had asked him to pick up, a small ask, practical, nothing unusual. He had let himself through the side gate as she sometimes permitted and was crossing toward the back door when the voices reached him through the kitchen window, which had been left open in the warmth of the evening. I'm trying to help. Emily's voice, controlled but fraying slightly at the edges. You're trying to replace what you abandoned. Eleanor's voice, precise as a cut. A pause. That's not what this is. Then what is it? You send money for years, I don't cash the checks. You send people, I send them away. And now you come here yourself and you bring your trucks and your contractors and you rearrange my house and you call it help. A brief silence. What you call help, Emily, looks a great deal like guilt. The word landed the way Eleanor intended it to, cleanly, with force. I left because I had to, Emily said, quieter now. You know that. I know what you chose. It wasn't a choice. Everything is a choice. Eleanor's voice didn't rise. That was the most devastating thing about it. It never needed to. You chose your career over your family. You chose strangers over the people who raised you. And now you come back with money and contractors and you stand in my kitchen and you tell me you're helping. A pause in which the kitchen seemed to hold its breath. I didn't raise you to buy your way back into rooms you walked out of. Daniel stood very still in the garden. He heard the sound of a chair being pushed back, footsteps, a door, then silence. He left the medication on the back step and walked home without knocking. In the days that followed, Emily Ashford did not leave. This surprised him. He had half expected the black car to disappear after the argument, to slip back into whatever ordered, climate-controlled world it had come from. Instead, it remained at the curb, and Emily remained in the house, or tried to. He would see her at the gate in the mornings, or standing in the garden with the deliberate casualness of someone who was not sure whether they were allowed to be there, or sitting on the front steps in the evenings with a coffee cup and her phone, and the look of a woman who was putting in time she didn't know how to spend. She knocked on Eleanor's door. Eleanor did not answer. She left food on the kitchen counter. It was moved to the doorstep untouched. She sat in the garden and waited. Eleanor sat in the sitting room with the curtains drawn. The neighbors watched. This was inevitable. Hartwell Lane was, at its core, a community of careful observers. Daniel heard the whispers. She abandoned that old woman for years. Now she comes back like nothing happened. Money can't fix everything, can it? The looks that followed Emily down the street were not cruel exactly. They were the looks of people who had already decided the shape of a story and were watching it confirm itself. And Emily bore it. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She bore it with a composure that looked from the outside like indifference and that he was increasingly certain was something else entirely. He had met indifferent people. They didn't knock on doors that weren't answered. They didn't sit on steps waiting. They didn't come back every year with their expensive coats and their unreadable faces and stand at a gate to be met with a bucket of water. Indifferent people stopped showing up. Emily Ashford kept showing up. He wasn't sure yet what that meant. But on the fourth evening, when Emma pulled her hand from his on the sidewalk and ran up to the woman sitting on the steps, "Your shoes are really shiny," and Emily Ashford looked down at his daughter with an expression that cracked just slightly. The careful surface of her face, Daniel filed it away. The most powerful person on this street, he was beginning to think, was also the one who didn't know where she belonged on it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the beginning of everything. It started, as most things did on Hartwell Lane, with something small. Daniel had come by on a Tuesday morning with Eleanor's newspaper, a habit she had never asked for and never acknowledged, which he took to mean she had accepted it, and found Emily on the front steps again, this time with a laptop open and a phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, speaking to someone about quarterly margins with the focused efficiency of a person who had learned to work in whatever space was available. She glanced up when he opened the gate. He held up the newspaper. She looked back at her screen. He knocked. Eleanor answered almost immediately, which meant she had been watching from the window. "The Hargrove account," Emily was saying behind him. "I don't care about the timeline. I care about the pointer you can use or record or style." A pause. One. No. Run it again. Eleanor held the door open just wide enough for Daniel to pass through, looked once at her granddaughter's back and closed it. Inside, the kitchen was quiet and smelled of coffee and old wood, the way it always did. Eleanor moved to her chair with the careful economy of someone who did not want you to notice that her hip had been troubling her. "She's still here," Daniel said. It was not a question. "Unfortunately." He set the newspaper on the table. "Do you want me to?" "No, whoa." Eleanor opened the paper without looking at it. "Sit down, Daniel. You hover like a man with somewhere to be." He sat. For a few minutes there was only the sound of Eleanor turning pages and the distant murmur of Emily's voice through the window. Then Eleanor said without looking up, she rearranged the pantry. Daniel considered this. Did she put things back where they were? She put things where she thought they should be. A pause. Which is, I suppose, the root of the problem. He didn't say anything. Eleanor turned another page, set it down, turned her coffee cup a quarter turn the way she did when she was deciding something. You have the look of a man waiting for me to explain myself, she said. No, Daniel said. I was thinking about the hedges. She studied him. Then, apparently satisfied, she picked up the paper again. A full minute passed. She was always like that, Eleanor said, and for a moment her voice did something complicated, not quite softening, but shifting, the way light shifts on a wall when something moves outside. Even as a child, always certain she knew the better way, she closed the newspaper. The trouble with people who are usually right is that they never learn the difference between useful and welcome. Daniel looked at the window. Through the glass, Emily's voice had quieted. He could see her reflection in the morning light, the laptop closed now, the phone down, her hand still in her lap, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't there. She keeps coming back, he said. Every year, you said. Eleanor did not answer right away. When she did, her voice had returned to its usual register, precise and final like a door clicking shut. People who feel guilty always come back. It doesn't mean they've changed. Daniel thought about this all the way home. It was Emma who broke the ice, the way Emma broke most things. Directly, without warning, and with complete conviction that what she was doing was correct. They had been on their way back from the park, Emma still flushed from the swings, insisting on carrying the empty water bottle herself because she was helping, when they passed the Ashford house. Emily was at the gate, not going in or coming out, just standing in the particular way she had that made it look like stillness, but felt, if you were watching closely, like something held very tightly in place. Emma stopped. Your shoes are really shiny, she said. Emily looked down. The expression that crossed her face was brief and unguarded, gone almost before it was there, the kind of look people have when something small catches them entirely off guard. Thank you, she said. Are they uncomfortable? My party shoes hurt my feet. A pause. Something at the corner of Emily's mouth. A little? Yes. Emma nodded seriously as though this confirmed a long-held theory. You should get ones with cushions. She tilted her head. Do you live here now? I'm visiting. With the old lady, she gave me a book once. It had a bear in it. Emma seemed to consider Emily with the particular thoroughness of a 5-year-old conducting an assessment. She doesn't smile a lot, but she's nice. Yes, Emily said. She is. Daniel put his hand on Emma's shoulder. We should let... What's your name? Emily. I'm Emma. A beat. We have almost the same name. And Emily Ashford, who had been named in Forbes, who had walked out of boardrooms when she disagreed with the direction of a meeting, who had built a company on the principle that clarity was a form of respect, looked at his 5-year-old daughter and said, with complete sincerity, we do. On the walk home, Emma informed Daniel that Emily was actually nice, and that her shoes were the shiniest she had ever seen in real life. Daniel agreed. He looked back once. Emily was still at the gate watching them go. Over the next several days, the geography of their interactions shifted. It began because of the garden. Eleanor's back had been worse than usual, and Daniel had offered to take over the hedging for a week. He came by in the early afternoons when Eleanor was resting, and it was during one of these sessions that Emily appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and stood there for a moment with the look of someone who had made a decision they were not entirely certain about. She held one out. He took it. They stood in the garden and did not speak for a while. The silence was the specific kind that happens between 2 people who are both waiting to see what the other will do. You do this often? She said finally. When she needs it. Emily looked at the hedges. She doesn't ask for help. No, well. But you just... She stopped. It's easier, Daniel said, when you stop waiting to be asked. She looked at him then directly, and for a moment he had the odd sensation of being assessed, of something behind her eyes calculating, the way he imagined she looked at a company before a takeover, figuring out the structure, the weak points, the things that didn't add up. You're not from money, she said. It was not unkind. It was just direct. No, wasn't. But she trusts you. She tolerates me. I think that's her version of trust. The corner of Emily's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. You'd be surprised how rare that is. He went back to the hedges. She stayed. After a while, she said, apparently to herself, I keep doing everything wrong with her. Daniel didn't look up. You keep doing everything right by your own logic. A pause. What does that mean? It means, he said, setting down the shears for a moment, that you fix the bathroom railing because it's a practical solution. You send money because money solves problems. You hired contractors because the house needed work. He picked the shears back up. All of that makes complete sense from a certain angle. But she doesn't need her problems solved. She needs someone to sit in the room with her. He glanced back. There's a difference. Emily was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to do that, she said at last, and he heard underneath the flatness of the admission something that had the weight of years in it. Emma helped, in the way that Emma always helped, by being entirely immune to the atmosphere that adults created around themselves. She had begun to greet Emily whenever she saw her, with the casual ownership of a child who has decided someone is simply part of the landscape now. Emily, for her part, had begun to watch for Emma the way people watch for something that asks nothing of them and gives back more than expected. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. She had at some point been something else, something that could laugh like that without calculating the cost. He just didn't know yet what had changed it. He found out on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day, in the way that the days that change things usually are. Eleanor had asked him to bring a box down from the upper closet. Her hip would not allow the stairs, and she was clear that Emily was not to be asked. And he had done it, and on his way back through the hall, he had heard Emily's voice from the sitting room, low and unguarded in a way he had not heard before, speaking on the phone. He had not meant to slow down. He had not meant to listen. But the words that came through the half-open door were not the words of a composed woman on a business call. They were quieter than that, more careful. I know what it looked like, David. I know what she saw. A pause. No, I'm not asking you to explain it to her. I need you to understand that what I chose and what I wanted were not the same thing. Daniel moved away from the door then. He didn't need to hear the rest. He had heard enough to understand the shape of it, not the details, which were not his, but the architecture. A choice that was not a choice, and a woman who had paid for it in both directions. He sat in the kitchen with the box on the table. He thought about the uncashed checks, the way Emily sat on the front steps not like someone who owned the place, but like someone who was asking permission from a house. The annual visits that went nowhere. He thought, she didn't leave because she wanted to. And then, Eleanor doesn't know that. And then, with the careful certainty of a man who had learned when not to involve himself, that is not mine to fix. He picked up the box, walked down the hall, said nothing. Ain't I? But something had changed in the weight of the house, in the way the afternoon light fell through the kitchen window, in the quiet from the sitting room, in the sound of Eleanor's steady, deliberate footsteps overhead. Both of them were waiting for something that the other one was also waiting for. And they had been waiting in silence for a very long time. The gap between two people who want the same thing is often the most unbridgeable of all. It happened on a Friday morning in the quiet hour before the street woke up. Daniel was making Emma's breakfast when his phone rang, an unknown number which he almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up, and the voice on the other end was Mrs. Patterson from number 12, who had been awake since 5 and had seen the light on in Eleanor's kitchen, and then heard at 6:30 a sound she described only as wrong. He was across the street in 4 minutes. The front door was unlocked. Eleanor never left the front door unlocked, and he found her at the bottom of the staircase, sitting very upright against the wall, in the precise way of someone who has decided that the manner in which they sit on the floor matters enormously. Her hand was pressed flat against the railing post. Her expression was the expression she reserved for things that had personally offended her. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "You're on the floor." "I'm sitting on the floor. There is a distinction." She looked at her wrist, which was already beginning to swell. "I missed the last step. It was poorly designed." "It was the same step it's always been." "Then it was always poorly designed." He crouched beside her, and she allowed the examination in the way she allowed most of his help, by not actively resisting it, which was, for Eleanor Ashford, a significant concession. The wrist was sprained, not broken. He was reasonably sure of that, though not certain enough to leave it. Her hip had taken the impact. She would need to be seen. "I'll call Emily," he said. "You will not, Mew." "Eleanor, Dodd, Wad." "Daniel." Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness he heard something he had not heard from her before. Not pain, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who's been holding something rigid for a very long time and has, this morning, run out of the strength to keep holding it. "I don't want her to see me like this." He sat beside her on the floor. Outside, the street was beginning to stir. He could hear a car somewhere, a dog, Emma's television through his open front door. The house around them was quiet in the way that old houses are quiet, not empty, but full of the weight of everything that had happened in them. "She's going to find out either way," he said. Eleanor looked at the stairs. Her jaw was set. "She always wanted to fix things," she said quietly. Even as a child, she would come into a room and immediately begin rearranging it. A pause. "I used to think it was arrogance, that she always believed she knew better." She was quiet for a moment. "Now I wonder whether she was simply trying to make herself useful, whether that was how she asked to be loved." Daniel said nothing. "It's very inconvenient," Eleanor said, "to understand something 30 years too late." He called Emily. She arrived in 9 minutes, which meant she had been nearby, had perhaps never gone far. She came through the door without knocking and crossed the hall and knelt on the other side of her grandmother without a word, and her hands, when they checked the wrist, were steady and careful, and she did not say, "I told you about the stairs," or "This is why you needed the railing," or anything that was true and useless. She said, "I've got you." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Then she looked away, but she did not pull her hand back. Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment before he left. He thought about Emma, who would be awake by now and would want to know where he had gone so early. He thought about Eleanor, who would never ask for anything and needed someone who already knew. He thought about Emily, who had arrived 9 minutes after a phone call and had not said one useful, unnecessary word. He had spent 6 years reading this street. He had learned Eleanor through preserves and silence. He had learned Emma through her utter refusal to be anything other than exactly what she was. He did not know yet what he was learning here. But he took out his phone and canceled the afternoon he had planned, a work errand, nothing critical, and texted his neighbor about Emma's pickup. And then he went home and made a grocery list and came back at noon. Nobody asked him to. That was, he was beginning to think, the whole point. For 3 days, the house on Hartwell Lane became something different. The contractors were gone. The renovation was long finished. There were no deliveries, no professionals, no organized systems of care being imposed from a respectful distance. There was only Emily, in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, learning, through a combination of observation and reluctant instruction, how Eleanor took her coffee. There was only Emily reading aloud from the newspaper at the kitchen table because Eleanor's wrist made it difficult to hold the pages, her voice careful and neutral, pausing when Eleanor wanted to comment on something and waiting until she was finished. There was only Emily sleeping in the spare room down the hall, waking at 2 in the morning when she heard movement, and appearing in the doorway without being asked. It was, Daniel thought, watching from the edges when he came by each day with groceries, the most honest he had ever seen either of them. There was no performance in it. Emily was not demonstrating her competence or her generosity. Eleanor was not maintaining the architecture of her self-sufficiency. They were simply two people in a house, doing the ordinary work of being present, and the ordinariness of it, the unheroic, unremarkable texture of it, was, he suspected, exactly what had been missing for the past 20 years. Emma came with him on the second afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor while Emily made lunch, and the three of them talked about the bear book that Eleanor had given Emma, and Eleanor said it had been Emily's once, and Emily went still at the counter for a moment before she turned back and said, quietly, "I love that book." Eleanor did not answer right away. Then, "I know. You read it until the spine broke." Emily turned back to the counter. But Daniel saw her shoulders drop, just slightly, just once, the way a person's shoulders drop when they set down something they have been carrying for a very long time. It was the second evening. Emma was asleep on the sofa under Eleanor's reading blanket, which Eleanor had provided without comment. Daniel was in the kitchen doorway, and the two women were at the table, and the silence between them was the kind that had stopped being hostile and become instead simply large. Emily spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it had none of the careful engineering of her usual precision. It was just a voice in a kitchen at the end of a long day. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said. "I want you to know that." Eleanor's hands were folded on the table. She did not speak. "I left because the alternative was to stay and become someone I didn't recognize, and I thought—" Emily stopped, steadied. "I thought that if I built something real, something on my own terms, I could come back, and it would be different. And I kept waiting until it was big enough, or successful enough, or—" She stopped again. "I don't know what I was waiting for. I think I was waiting until I felt like I had earned the right to come home." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly. "You'd leave to hurt me," Eleanor said at last. It was not a question, exactly. It was the sound of someone turning something over for the last time and setting it down. "No, I know that." Eleanor's voice was even, but the evenness was a different kind now. Not closed, but measured, the way you measure something you're finally ready to say aloud. "I knew it, I think, before you were gone a year. But knowing something and releasing someone from it are not the same thing." She looked at her folded hands. "I was angry, and when I am angry, I am thorough." Emily made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "You chose to leave rather than be diminished," Eleanor said. "I understand that. I even respect it. What I could not forgive, what I could not find my way past, was the silence afterward. The checks I could not cash because cashing them meant accepting the terms of your absence. The years that passed in which you built everything, and I sat and waited for a conversation that never came. Years that passed in which you built everything." Her voice did not break, but it did something quieter than breaking. It simply became honest. "You gave me your success. I wanted your phone calls." The kitchen was very still. "I didn't think you wanted them," Emily said, and the rawness in it was the rawness of something said for the first time after years of not being said. Every time I called you, you were so unchanged. You were so certain. And I felt like, she shook her head. I felt like I had nothing to offer you that you would accept, like showing up was only ever going to be another way to fail. Eleanor was quiet for so long that Emily looked up. And for a moment, just a moment, her grandmother's face did the thing it had been doing for 20 years. It closed. The jaw set. The hands tightened on the table. The old, familiar architecture of someone who had built her dignity out of not needing things, reasserting itself out of sheer muscle memory. Emily saw it. Her shoulders drew back slightly, the old posture returning, the boardroom posture, the gate posture, the standing in the rain posture. The kitchen held its breath. Then Eleanor looked down at her own hands, and something, not broke, but released, passed through her face, like a door that had been stuck for years finally moving on its hinge. Then we were both waiting, Eleanor said, for the other one to stop waiting. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It had no tension in it. It was just the ordinary, enormous silence of two people who had said the true thing and were sitting with the fact of it. Daniel moved back from the doorway without a sound. Some things did not need a witness. They only needed to happen. On the last morning of that week, Daniel came by early before Emma was awake and found Emily in the garden. She was sitting on the old stone bench by the far hedge, her coat pulled around her, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking at the house the way she had looked at it the very first morning she arrived. But the brace was gone from it now. It was something quieter, the look of someone who had stopped preparing for impact. He sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. The garden was still and pale in the early light, and the house behind them was breathing, the way houses breathe when the people inside them are sleeping. She asked me to stay, Emily said. Not to take over the company, not for any reason she could name, just, will. She turned the cup in her hands. She said the house was too quiet. Daniel looked at the garden. What did you say? I said I had a company in another city. A pause. She said the company would survive a long weekend. Another pause, smaller. She wasn't wrong. He thought about Eleanor in the kitchen, saying, she always wanted to make herself useful. He thought about Emily at the gate every morning, waiting for a door that didn't open. He thought about the years between them, the uncashed checks, the unreturned calls, the annual appearances that neither of them knew how to name. He thought about how much energy it took to maintain a wound, and how much became available when you finally put it down. You don't have to solve it today, he said. Emily looked at the house. Something in her face had changed. Had been changing, he realized, since the morning Eleanor had let her hold her hand at the bottom of the stairs. The precision was still there. The composure was still there. But underneath them, something had loosened that he didn't think she'd noticed yet. She would notice it later, probably. In a boardroom, when she laughed at something without calculating whether it was strategic. On a call, when she told someone what she actually thought rather than what was most effective. Small things, but the kind of small things that compound. I know, she said. And then, after a moment, Emma asked me if I was going to be here next weekend. He looked at her. She was looking at the house. I told her I'd check my calendar. A pause. And then she told me that calendars were just for people who didn't want to say yes yet. He thought about his daughter, who was 5 years old and had apparently developed the emotional acuity of someone 3 times her age, and felt the specific pride of a parent who cannot take any credit for it. She's not wrong, he said. Emily turned to look at him then, and he saw it, that unguarded thing, the one he had first glimpsed at the gate when Emma had asked about her shoes. The one that didn't calculate. The one that was simply underneath everything else, just there. No, she said. She's really not. The sun came up fully over Hartwell Lane, and the garden filled with it. The old stone bench, the overgrown hedges, the house with its iron gates and its 50 years of accumulated silence, and the two women sleeping inside it, who had, the night before, said the true things and survived. Daniel sat in the morning light and did not feel the need to say anything. This, he had learned, from Eleanor's preserves and Emma's unfiltered assessments, and 6 years of reading A Street Like Weather, was the only thing that had ever mattered. Not the performance of belonging, but the willingness to stay. Not because everything was fixed, but because some things were worth the staying.